towards Baneswar. So it's very unlikely he'll come within 3:30. So he gave me permission to start. म सुरु गर्छु आज तीनजना वक्ताहरूलाई म चिनाउँछु आजको किताबबारे म सुरुमा केही कुरा भन्छु त्यसपछि द एडिटर बेन्जामिन लिन्डर अफ काठमाडौँ अ रिडर he couldn't be here he's based in Leiden in the Netherlands but he sent us a video video was recorded quite a few weeks ago so it's been with us for a while सुरुमा हामी 10 मिनेट उहाँको भिडियो हेर्छौँ त्यसपछि सुमिनाजीले बोल्नुहुन्छ प्रणयजी त्यस बीचमा आइपुग्नु भयो प्रणयजी 2 नम्बर रचनाजी 3 नम्बर प्रणयजी आइपुग्नु भएन रचनाजी 2 नम्बर अनि प्रणय आइपुग्नु भयो 3 नम्बर अब प्रणय आइनै पुग्नु भएन भने चाहिँ अब के गर्ने मलाई थाहा छैन सो द्याट वी आर लस हैन सो आजको आई मिन कहिले कहिले यस्तै हुन्छ सो व्हेन आई कन्ट्याक्टेड द 3 स्पिकर्स वी डिड नट एक्चुअली डिस्कस अबाउट इन व्हाट ल्याङ्ग्वेज दे विल स्पिक युजुअली चौतारीमा हामीले कार्यक्रम गर्दाखेरि इङ्ग्लिस नेपाली बोथ भनेर सोध्ने गर्छौँ हैन यसपटक त्यो सोध्नै बिर्सेछ सो बोथ अफ देम एन्ड आई अज्युम प्रणय अल्सो probably prepared their whatever they want to say about the book in English so we'll do most of that their presentations in English तर पछिको गफ त जुन जुन भाषामा गर्न मन लाग्यो त्यही भाषामा गर्ने हो अब ट्रान्सलेसन कसैलाई चाहिँदैन क्यारे अनि मजाले सजिलो आफूलाई जुन सजिलो भाषामा जे कुरा सोध्न मन लाग्छ त्यही सोध्ने हो यसो भन्नु अब यो किताब चाहिँ काठमाडौँ रिडर ठ्याक्कै यो आइडिया कहिले सुरु भयो भन्ने कुरा भन्नलाई अलिकति गाह्रो छ किनभने यो यस्तो अब फलानु मितिमा सुरु भयो भने यो किताब बन्नुपर्छ भनेर लागेको मलाई चाहिँ एटलिस्ट धेरै वर्ष भइसक्यो रफली 10 वर्ष जति भयो होला यहाँ धेरैलाई थाहा होला मार्क लिक्टी भन्ने एकजना नेपाल काठमाडौँको बारेमा मेरो हिसाबले खतरा किताब लेखेको एन्थ्रोपोलोजिस्ट अमेरिकन एन्थ्रोपोलोजिस्ट हुनुहुन्छ उहाँ र म सँगै ग्रेजुएट स्कुलमा पढेको हो उहाँ मभन्दा 2 वर्ष सिनियर हुनुहुन्थ्यो र सुटेबली मोडर्न 2003 मा निस्केपछि 2008 मा हामीले रिप्रिन्ट गऱ्यौँ र कुनै बेला मैले उसलाई चाहिँ काठमाडौँ सम्बन्धी एउटा रिडर निकाल्नुपर्छ है भनेर भने अनि त्यो कालान्तरमा हामी विभिन्न अरू प्रोजेक्टहरुमा काम गर्दै गयौँ सिनास भन्ने जर्नलसँगै निकाल्यौँ अनि त्यो जर्नल निकाल्ने काम दुःखको काम भएको हुनाले उ र मैले धेरै प्रुफ रिडिङ गर्दा गर्दा हामीले यो किताब आफैले निकाल्न सक्छौँ भन्ने कुरामा हामीलाई अब शंका हुन थाल्यो अनि लकिली बेन्जामिन लिन्डर इज मार्क्स PhD student. So Ben finished his PhD under Mark at the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2019. Ben ko actually research area चाहिँ थमेल हो हैन he's written many chapters articles on थमेल including one chapter in Sinas and in several other journals and Ben लाई चाहिँ मैले roughly 5 years जति अगाडि चाहिँ अब यो काम चाहिँ तिमीले नै गर्नु पर्यो अथवा if you have a co-editor in mind you can also you're free to do that भनेर एउटा इमेल पठाएँ अनि त्यसपछि चाहिँ यो काम एक्चुअली यो किताबै बन्ने काम चाहिँ सक्रिय रूपमा सुरु भयो भने सो इन अ वे ओरिजिनल आइडिया टु अबाउट 5 इयर्स चाहिँ किताब बन्नुपर्छ भन्ने गफ गर्दा गर्दै बित्यो र 5 इयर्स अगोको चाहिँ द फर्स्ट टेबल अफ कन्टेन्ट्स मेड बाई बेन showed up. That table of contents had 45 articles in it as possibilities to be included in a reader of this kind. And my first reaction is it's too big. 45 articles means a volume that is at least 800 pages. Or given our experience of producing more than 100 books out of Martin Chautari, anything that's bigger than 500 pages is a fat book that's very hard to produce and actually work with as a reader also. So I said we should go for a book that's under 500 pages, so cut. So initially there were 5 sections and he basically decided to go with 3 sections. So the book as published in a few weeks ago has 3 sections, 16 chapters, all of which have been published previously. 1 or 2 chapters have undergone some revisions between Ben, in correspondence between Ben and the author, respective author. There are most chapters were published as they were originally published in some other journals. Some of these chapters were published in Sinas, some in this other journal called Himalaya, which is put out by the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies in the US, and other articles were published in other journals, except one chapter that's published here, republished here, is actually comes out of a book. So among all the contributors, I'm happy to note there's one we have here, Amrutjanji. र अरू contributors who are based in Kathmandu, they said they will come. Biresa, I suppose he's also stuck in some more traffic car. So unfortunately, we have to, just proceed. त्यसपछि यसमा काम चाहिँ 60 chapters तय भइसकेपछि we basically have to get reprint permission. सिनासको त obviously मण्डलाको आफ्नै publisher भइहाल्यो, सजिलो भइहाल्यो. हिमालयको पनि there was no fuss. And luckily for Ben and for us and for this book, the other authors worked with Ben to get reprint rights from the editors and the publishers of the original articles, whichever platform they had been published in. So that actually happened rather quickly and rather in a sajilo way. Contrast that with a book that Sarah put together in 2023 on the transition, the second volume, not the volume that came out edited by Pranaya in 2022. Sarah's case in the initial TOC, we could not get reprint permission for more than half the articles that she had wanted to keep in her book. Primarily because some of the reprint people to whom I wrote emails never replied, and some sent me to their reprint right permission platforms, and one of them wanted to charge something like $800 to give permission to reprint one article. And so we just had to not go with the original selection that she had made. Fortunately for Ben, fortunately for us, fortunately for the editors, we did not run into that kind of problem in the making of this book. So Ben was very happy, we are very happy. Then Ben did a lot of work. Typically, when we produce such a book out of Chautari, there is the Sina/Chautari house style of citations. Ben and the authors worked together to actually convert the original of 5-6 ठाउँमा पब्लिश भएका आर्टिकलहरूको चाहिँ साइटेसन स्टाइल 5-6 तरिको हुन्छ नि, यो सोशल साइन्टिस्टहरूको एउटा बौलटीपन हो, सिकेर हाँस्दै हुनुहुन्छ के अरे बौलटीपन हो, यस्तो यस्तो स्टाइलमा गर्ने भनेर भने आउँछन् जर्नलमा आर्टिकल छाप्नको लागि, अनि हामी दुःखसो गरेर त्यही अनुसार आफ्नो आर्टिकल्सहरू स्टाइल फर्मेट गरेर प्रेजेन्ट गर्छौँ. बट बेनले चाहिँ धेरै जसो वर्किङ विथ द अथर्स द्याट स्टाइल कन्भर्सन आफैले गर्नुभयो. द मनुस्क्रिप्ट केम टु अस सम टाइम इन 24. अनि यहाँको प्रोडक्सन टिम मनुस्क्रिप्टको चाहिँ किशोर प्रधान, हाम्रो टेक्निकल गुरुजी विथ कम्प्युटर, एन्ड हाम्रो रमेश पराजुली, हाम्रो एडिटर अफ मार्टिन चौतारी's publication program, they took over and basically produced the book. So in the end, apart from coming up with the idea initially and actually commissioning Ben to do this work, I fortunately didn't have to do a lot of work apart from one final looking over just. That's the background. अरु चाहिँ आज यो किताब चाहिँ 25% डिस्काउन्टमा अवेलेबल छ at the desk over there. So if you're interested in buying that, you can do that after our program is over. As a program ko format say basically we'll watch the video from Ben, 10 minutes, and then the speakers get to talk for 15 minutes each. So if Pranaya shows up in the meantime, we'll have 45 minutes of commentary from the 3 speakers. If he doesn't show up on time, 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor, and then there is some chia and cookies at the end. We'll then, after the program is finished, we'll just hang around and talk. About Ben ko video dekham.
Sumina, namaste. Thank you all for joining this book launch event, and thank you to everyone at Chautari for organizing this event. I'm sorry I can't be there in person to hear the feedback and the discussion. I wish I could be. I look forward to hearing it remotely. But because I'm not able to be in Kathmandu at the moment, I wanted to record a short video welcoming you all, so welcome. And also just giving you a little bit of an introduction to the volume, and especially the story of the volume. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ben Linder. I serve as the editor for this project, and I'm currently based at Linder University in the Netherlands, where I serve as the coordinator for public and engaged scholarship at the International Institute for Asian Studies. By training, I'm an anthropologist, and my dissertation work anyway, was about Tamil and more broadly about kind of urban cultural politics, I would say, in Kathmandu. And that's really how I came to this volume. So the roots of this book can actually be traced to when I was living in Nepal between 2015 and 2017, doing that field work that would become my dissertation. Around that time, Pratyush G at Martin Chautari was working on a bibliography. So as many of you will know, Martin Chautari frequently publishes these bibliographies on different themes and topics, just as public resources to gather this kind of emerging work around particular themes. And around that time, 2016 or so, Pratyush was working on one about recent articles on Kathmandu. And I think the idea was that around that time, or even leading up to that time, the last 25 years, 25, 30 years, have seen a shift in how people focus on Kathmandu and its urban dynamics. So I think everyone in this room will be familiar with this story, but basically it felt to me and Pratyush and many others that the kind of work being done on Nepal by social scientists, and specifically about the Kathmandu Valley, was beginning to shift, and we saw different kinds of interests taking shape. And I think the bibliography was Martin Chautari's attempt to sort of start capturing that. And I think Pratyush can correct me afterwards if I'm wrong. I think after the first edition of that bibliography was published, he reached out to a few colleagues, one of whom was me, to ask for new suggestions for the second edition, or the second version of that bibliography, and then subsequent versions. And many of the people he reached out to ultimately did end up in the present volume we're discussing with chapters of their own. So around that time, this list just sort of kept growing and growing, and with a few other things that I go into in the foreword, which I hope you all have a chance to read, the foreword and introduction to the book, it felt like this work was sort of coalescing into a new kind of subfield within Nepal studies, which was really focused on urban dynamics and urban cultural politics. So it didn't take long, I think it was maybe 2017 or 2018, before Pratyush G again emailed me and asked whether we might use that bibliography, which was now by then in its fourth edition, I think, whether we might use that as the basis for an edited volume, a kind of anthology about recent work on Kathmandu. And of course, I was happy to do that. It was exactly the kind of book I wish I had had as a young graduate student, just kind of starting out, trying to understand Kathmandu and figure out what the important kind of seminal texts in the field were. So, of course, I thought this book should exist, and I was happy to be asked to do it. So, in conversation with colleagues at Martin Chautari, we started tossing around ideas for a table of contents. And I will say the first version of that included almost 50 articles spread across 5 thematic sections. So it was obviously too ambitious and would never fit into a single physical book. So then the problem became how to whittle it down. And I guess I should say there were a few factors that were into this because, of course, some colleagues have worked on different topics over the years, but we didn't want to repeat authors so much. We wanted a diversity of topics, so several people working on the same topic sometimes created issues. So we had to make some difficult cuts, and ultimately one of the things we chose to focus on was the last 25 years. I think initially the volume we had hoped would, or we envisioned would cover a slightly longer time span, but it just became unfeasible. And so we basically decided the last 25 years, so 21st century texts basically. And as people will know, that's been a very eventful 25 years in Nepal's history and also Kathmandu's history in particular. So basically since 2000, anything that was contemporary to that period. So we also unfortunately excluded a lot of work that was published in that period, but about historical dimensions, right? So a new work about earlier history was excluded because we wanted the articles and the chapters to feel contemporary. So it really is about the current city for almost all of the chapters. The one exception is maybe chapter 1, which is Niels Gutschkow's chapter, which is about the history of urban planning. So we wanted him to give that context. What we ultimately ended up with after some back and forth and a lot of kind of honing and some tough choices about what we needed to exclude were the chapters that you have in front of you divided into 3 thematic sections. So part 1, urban form, planning and housing. Part 2, urban cultural politics, identity and memory. and part 3, Urban Lives, Labor and Consumption. Clearly, this wasn't an exhaustive list, and there were so many things that we wish we would have included, topics that we wish could have been represented in the final volume that we just had to leave on the cutting room floor. But what we hope we've created here is a volume that can serve not only as kind of a handy reference for scholars and colleagues who just want all of some of the key texts collected into a single volume, but also an introduction, as I said, to new graduate students, young scholars who are just looking for a place to start understanding Kathmandu, and we hope we've created that in this book. I want to say a few things by way of concluding, so if you'll bear with me, I want to thank a few people. First of all, I want to thank all the contributors to this volume. All of these works were previously published, of course, some 25 years ago almost, so it was quite a process updating them, and so many of us had to do another round of editing, do some updating, and that took a lot of effort, and I appreciate all the colleagues who put a lot of time and energy into that. I'm also thankful relatedly to all the publishers of the journals and books that these articles originally appeared in. So that's Studies in Nepali History and Society, which is, of course, Kathmandu Book Point and Martin Chautari, the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies, who publish Himalaya, where several of these also came from, the Bergham Journals, who publishes Focal, a journal, Taylor and Francis, who publishes National Identities and Ethnos, sorry for the long list, Cambridge University Press, who published the volume Epicenter to Aftermath, which is where I think Stephanie Lauder's chapter came from, and the Society for Cultural Anthropology, who publishes the journal Cultural Anthropology, the George Washington University Institute for Ethnographic Research, which publishes Anthropological Quarterly, and last one, I promise, the German Association for Asian Studies, which publishes Asian Journal. So they really made it very seamless to get all of these works reprinted, and it was really heartening to see how willing so many of them were to give us free copyright rights to reprint the volume in Nepal. So I also hope this volume makes these important works on Kathmandu more accessible generally to a wider public. I'm also grateful to all of the colleagues at Martin Chautari, especially Pratyush G for initiating this whole volume, not only through the bibliography I mentioned, but also for inviting me to do it and really kind of helping to shepherd the project the whole time. Ramesh Parajuli was also working behind the scenes the whole time, so thanks to you, Ramesh G, and Kishore Pradhan, who did excellent work on the text and the layout and the final design of the book. I think it looks great. I'm actually still waiting for my copies to get delivered, so I'm jealous that you all have them physically with you. Mine are on the way. They should be delivered any day now. So I want to thank everyone at Martin Chautari for getting this book together. By all accounts, I've heard from many people that it looks great. I'm also grateful to Sabin Nubik, who in particular, who has a chapter in this book, and I know he's with you today, by Sabin. I'm really grateful to him also for writing afterward this text. Unfortunately, because of COVID and a new position at Leiden University, I haven't been to Kathmandu in some time, and which much to my regret. And I feel that Sabin's afterword that he wrote special for this book is a key contribution to kind of update everyone, to bring everybody up to speed on the last 5 years even, which is not really covered in the most of the chapters of the text. So thank you, Sabin, for that. With that, I think I'll leave you all. Thank you so much for joining the book launch event. I look forward to doing it remotely, and I look forward to hearing any comments or feedback that you might have on the book. Thank you, and enjoy the event.
So if you're watching from Leiden, Ben, thank you. Thank you for the video. त्यो पछाडिको त्यो बत्ती बाल्नु प्लिज. So those of you who come, just come. We've heard a recorded video from Benjamin Linder, who happens to be the editor of the book that we're discussing here today. And Pranaya has also just arrived. So I'll be asking him to come right up. Pani dimta pani. Sorry. यता बसौँ यता बसौँ So when I was planning this discussion in collaboration with several colleagues at Chautari, I basically wanted to hear commentary on the book because I had also been part of, as Ben discussed, a part of the process that made the book happen. Commentaries from at least 2-3 different types of people. By types I mean professionally types. Okay. So first one that got pursued in this program is Pranaya Ji. So he was the one pursued. त्यसपछि उहाँहरु दुईजना got pursued more or less around the same time. So I'm really happy that we have a writer who is both a fiction writer and a real life reporter. If you don't follow his column weekly, then I recommend that you do that. Comes out on Fridays only. Yes. Ani Rachana ji is a PhD सिधाउन लागेको अलिअलि पीडित researcher. So anybody who's actually done a PhD at the last stage will understand what I mean by the पीडित. हरेक दिन बिहान उठ्दाखेरिको first thought is it is still not done. भन्ने आउँछ नि त्योबाट गुजिरहनु भएको, but luckily she's just submitted and she's now just waiting to defend. So we are all hoping that that will happen real soon. र हाम्रो third person is Sumina Karki ji. जो चाहिँ अब shortमा डेभलपमेन्ट प्र्याक्टिसनर भन्दियौँ है अब सो उहाँहरूले अलि लामो लामो इन्ट्रोडक्सन पठाउनु भएको थियो प्रणयजीले एक लाइनको त्यो लामो इन्ट्रोडक्सन म पढ्दिनँ हैन यो अलि मैले गरिहालेँ हाम्रो अग्रिमेन्ट चाहिँ के भएको छ भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ सुमिनाजी विल स्पिक फर्स्ट एन्ड बिकज ही हेज एक्चुअली अराइभ प्रणयजी विल स्पिक सेकेन्ड he doesn't have a choice now and Rachana will speak last. So I will now request Suminaji to speak for roughly 15 minutes.
Thank you. म नेपाली इङ्ग्लिसमै बोल्छु बिचबिचमा नेपाली पनि हुन्छु होइन पहिला सुरु त I think thank you to Martin Chautari and Benjamin and all the authors for this book. Thank you दिनु पछाडि यो बारेमा पनि छ जुन म पछि खुलाउँछु होइन अनि सँगसँगै बधाई र कङ्ग्रेचुलेसन्स पनि होइन यो किताबको लागि. Now I've written down my review. I'm going to read it. So when I received this book, I was basically curious which Kathmandu did it deal with in terms of geography. Kathmandu as a metropolitan city, or Kathmandu as a valley, or Kathmandu as a district. Because I think with these different demarcations, the imagination of Kathmandu also alters and kind of stretches out. In the introduction of the book does tell us that it is about the valley. But more importantly, it is in the afterword of the book authored by Sumina. He gives an answer which helped me find some grounding. He writes, if one has to conceive of Kathmandu as an urban tale, it would be apt to call it a tale of three cities, Thapathali, Patan or Lolipur, and Kathmandu. And these three cities take on different contemporaneous form today. A heritage city, the slum, and modern city. And all these cities can be one of those three, or all three at the same time. So I'm glad that this kind of academic work that Kathmandu Linder has brought forward is getting some space. Because when I was doing my research for master's thesis, and I was a student of anthropology, it was a little way back. There wasn't much of anthropological work as in, talking about Kathmandu as an urban space, or like it has got urban dynamics and culture. And even if there was, I think it was not accessible. I remember reading and coming across Martin's book that I got in Martin Chautari, and that's it. I remember there used to be a conversation on if Kathmandu's modern aspect, a modern site, could be a subject for anthropological research, because because for ethnographic studies, the site had to be always out there in the wilderness, a very colonial perspective. The other conversation back then was also about whether an insider or local researcher could do ethnographic studies, because the issue around objectivity was always raised. And I used to come across that conversation more often in the anthropological classes that I attended. Since then, we might have come a long way. And Kathmandu's contemporary issues have definitely become a site of ethnographic studies. But who does this ethnographic study has not much changed, it seems. It seems a lot of Nepalis are not quite interested in writing about Kathmandu, at least academically. Now, moving on to my overall impression of the book. Since the book is in anthology format, each chapter stands on its own as well. So readers can pick and choose what interests them. There are definitely broader themes that bind them, yet each chapter is a world in itself. It has layers of stories to tell within a microsome of story unit. For instance, take the chapter on Sukumbasi and the politics of aesthetics, for example. On the surface, the Bagmati beautification project looked like a well-meaningful effort to clean up the river, but the chapter peels back the layers to show there are a lot more going on inside. It talks about Sukumbasi. It talks about how Sukumbasis are often labeled as inauthentic citizens, people who don't quite belong to the land, specifically Kathmandu. Then from an environmental lens, their presence is framed as a barrier to reviving the Bagmati civilization back to clean and healthy self, and basically choose an elite narrative. But the story does not stop there. The chapter also shows how Sukumbasis aren't just passive recipients of these development projects. They are exercising different powers to make themselves heard. In doing so, they have created different categories of Sukumbasis, and that might not be serving them. And this is just one slice of what the chapters offers us and explores. Each chapter, like I said earlier, has layers of stories within a small unit of a story. It's not a quick read, but if you sit with it, the book really opens up different ways of thinking about Kathmandu and its urban lives. Some chapters, like the first one on urban development and town planning, the other on road expansion and urban highway, are fairly easy to read. The chapters on the first part of the book, which deals with urban planning and housing, it clearly shows the failure of Nepal's public institutions in protecting public spaces and commons for us. Their failure in terms of regulating land use, not prioritizing people's mobility, rather the state is implementing plans that prioritize vehicles mobility, and it's pretty visible and frustrating for us, for the reader as well. And it pushes all this exclusionary redevelopment and displacement by using discourses of beautification or ecological renewal. So while reading the first chapter, to be honest, it got morbid for me because it seemed like everything was falling apart right and left. Everything was unjust. And I think that's the harsh reality of Kathmandu. The other point that I would like to make is, it is recently when I was taking public policy courses classes, the conversation in that class usually hovered around how policies in Nepal are really good. It's just that they're not implemented or materialized, and that's a different conversation to have as well. But a big part of the problem is how the policies and plans get made first in this place, Kathmandu. And in one of the chapters that deals with the Bagmati restoration talks about this issue through the narrative of Uttaran Vaidya, who is a lifelong Save Bagmati campaigner. Vaidya shows his longing to be part of a restoration plan efforts to preserve Bagmati. But what he saw instead was undemocratic approach in the restoration process, which he criticizes in this chapter, through his narrative in this chapter. And this was not only on the state or governments to do, as Boydie pointed out, it was the nexus between the state and the international development community that practiced undemocratic ways of working. One can clearly see the same kind of top-down undemocratic approach in another chapter as well, about the Republic Memorial, Ganatantra Smara. I'm not sure still if it's open to the public or not. The government was trying to tell a big national story of how Nepal moved from monarchy to a republic by building this memorial inside the royal palace grounds. But while doing all this, they didn't enable the public engagement in the planning process. The state or the people in the government wanted to push for a narrative and tell a story of transition from monarchy to republic by building a Ganatantra Smara in the form of palace compound. But even during such process, the state failed to take an open process. Now, some of the chapters in the book is a compelling reminder that special designs and material cultures like maps, architecture, and city layouts are far from neutral and are not straightforward what they seem. And I think that the everyday life kind of takes away that critical lens from us as well. So such writing that has been offered in this book offers us analytical frameworks and lens, and that critical lens. That is why I encourage everyone to read this book. For instance, the different depictions of Bhaktapur, for example, there is a tourist map of Bhaktapur that helps visitors find their way around, but at the same time, it turns the city into a product, something to be consumed. Then there's the government's version of the map, of Bhaktapur, which shows Bhaktapur in terms of development, roads, districts, houses, and on top of that, you have traditional mandala map, which represents the city in a completely different way, tied to ritual and culture. You know, on face value, it looks beautiful, but then inside it hides its vast hierarchical system. So even though Bhaktapur is seen as a heritage city, this map shows that there are multiple competing ideas of what the city is, who gets to divide a place and a city, who decides what version of the city gets shown and remembered. It pushes us to look beyond that everyday functional use of these feelings and understand them as a product of deeper political and cultural struggles. And even once a space or architecture or an object or a map is built or mapped, it does not have one fixed meaning. Those meanings can be shifting depending on who's looking and why. Some of these chapters are more complex and needs more attention. I think people who work like me 9 to 5 and have kids will need more than a month to really analyze the information of this book. Also, while this book is a collection of contemporary and urban Kathmandu, different chapters do show us the historical trajectories of issues that is being discussed, and whether it be land valuation or planning. While new types of spaces, identities, cultures are being produced, in all this certain elements of Kathmandu have changed, but it has not as well. There's this constant push and pull between what's new, what's deeply rooted in old systems, whether that's how the government works, how space is used, how decisions are made in Kathmandu. This idea of nested newness, nested newness captures that well. The new version of Kathmandu is still layered within older or outdated ways of doing things. So even as the city transforms, it's still carrying a lot of its past within it. So maybe in future, there's a lot to read and a lot to process in this book. I would also maybe, there will be more, I think, Kathmandu Linder. If we could also read on what's working in Kathmandu in terms of government institution, public institution, in terms of service delivery in Kathmandu. Because I think in terms of what is working will also help us figure out to learn from the past in terms of learning, building this new habit and culture and practice, and not saying always, it's the road, So with that, I wrap up my review. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your reading and for the comments. The book's been out for about 7 weeks. I know that's not enough time for everyone to read a book, so little apologies. Pranaya, when we announced that this book was with the printer, Pranaya wrote publicly he's looking forward to it, and right then and there he got fussed in being invited to speak here. As I introduced him earlier, he's a fiction writer, but he's also a reporter. And when I wrote a whole bunch of, I didn't really have a column, but I wrote a whole bunch of articles around 2017-18 for Kathmandu Post, and at that time he was also my editor. So Pranaya, you get to talk for about 15 minutes. Before I do that, I'm very glad to welcome the second of the contributors here, Shah, who's written a very important chapter here, but also has been doing very important work on documenting Kathmandu's modernity. So we can talk about that later if you're interested. So Pranaya.
Hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak. Password भन्दा पनि I guess it should be. I guess I should feel happy.
Password हाम्रो गफ हो.
No, I was very excited to see that this book is coming out because I don't think we have had this kind of a book that is really like academically engaging with the city of Kathmandu. So far we've had musings and more the non-fiction work, but less academic. So I wanted to see what it was about. I read the book, and it's not. I've written not. I wouldn't call it a review per se. It's more of a kind of a freewheeling essay that was triggered by the thoughts and everything that was triggered by what I read in this book. So I've written this essay, which I'm now going to read to you. It is, like I said, kind of freewheeling, so please bear with me. Okay, so here I go. In the book Invisible Cities, the Italian writer Italo Calvino describes the fictional city of Zaira, a city of relationships between the measurements of its space and the events of the past. He writes, a description of Zaira as it is today should contain all of Zaira's past. The city, however, does not tell its past, but contains it like the lines of a hand, written in the corners of the streets, the gratings of the windows, the banisters of the steps, the antenna of the lighting rods, the poles of the bags, every segment marked in turn with scratches, indentations, scrolls. Zaira reminds me of Kathmandu, which too does not tell its past, but contains it within itself. Kathmandu, as Thomas Bell tells us, is a palimpsest, but not one where the new overlays the old. In Kathmandu, things are not what they purport to be, and you are just as likely to find the old before you get to the new. For instance, in Patan in the 90s and 2000s, large concrete blocks replaced the wood and brick homes of old. These new homes are considered modern and cosmopolitan, but now, new or renovated houses are being built in a revivalist style, complete with carved wooden windows and exposed brick. The city thus comes to the new through the old. When I say Kathmandu, I don't just mean Kathmandu city. Kathmandu has lent its name to the valley. Names and places mutate and evolve, expanding beyond their borders. Editor Benjamin Linder, in his chapter Mobile Places, Toponymy and the Social-Spatial Extension of Thamel, writes about how Thamel has transcended its territorial limitations and has now grown amoeba-like to swallow whole neighborhoods. Sakupat, Jatha, Paknazol, Chhatrapati are now all ensconced within Thamel like Russian nesting dogs. Thamel has even produced Thamel to the south, a portmanteau of Thamsikel and Thamel. According to Linder, there are now restaurants, bars, and shops called Thamel on 5 continents, from Finland to Thailand, from London to Melbourne. A similar toponymic study of Kathmandu would yield similar results. Kathmandu is no longer bound by the city proper, or the district and valley to which it's given its name. Thomas Bell's book is called Kathmandu, even though it's mostly about Patan. Kathmandu is a New Zealand-based clothing brand. Kathmandu is a bicycle series from the German manufacturer Cube. Kathmandu is a restaurant in Salzburg, Austria, a restaurant in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, and multiple restaurants in Lima, Peru. Linder writes, Thamel has always been produced by mobilities, from its ancient history as Thambai down to its modern incarnation as a cosmopolitan hub. This is a history comprised of pilgrims and traders venturing across the Himalayas and Asia, foreign tourists seeking adventures in Nepal, and Nepalis migrating abroad in cycles of departure and return. The history of Thamel is the history of Kathmandu. Just as much as Thamel was shaped by multiple mobilities, so as Kathmandu. Kathmandu is an organism in more ways than one. It has long grown unfettered, unrestrained. Planners, both local and foreign, have attempted to provide a template for how the city should grow, but none have worked. The early history of Kathmandu is replete with international experts flown in to map their own desires onto the city. As Niels Gutschau, writes in the chapter Urban Development and Town Planning in Historical Perspective, planning in Nepal has little to do with anything that happens in that country. Planners came in as experts who pursued global, not local, development goals, and when they failed, they blamed the inadequate locals. That was then, as it is now. Homegrown planners might have replaced those from elsewhere, but they pursue similar aesthetic global goals. The city they envision is composed of boulevards and ring roads, flyovers and underpasses. A city of slick concrete where not a drop of water percolates into the ground. The ambitions are still global, not local. Planners now envision injecting Kathmandu into the global flow of mobile capital, offering the city as a spatial fix. This was true in 2013 when Gutschau first published his article, acknowledging that not much seems to have changed until today. Planning seems to have become one of the pervasive myths of the 20th century, and it remains true today in 2025. In the decades since the early planners first attempted to tame Kathmandu, the city has progressed, it has developed. Its tentacles now reach far into the hills that once acted as formidable walls. If progress is to be measured in the number of large matchbox-shaped concrete buildings with glass facades, then Kathmandu has certainly made much progress. Then why does stepping foot into the city every day feel like fighting a war? A water pipe has burst in front of my home, flooding the walkway with water ankle deep. Pavements disappear as I walk up them. Large piles of sand and gravel have been dumped unceremoniously in the middle of pavements. The closest park is kilometers away, and often the gates are chained with a large padlock. Gutschau writes, in present-day Kathmandu, one often comes across a sense of despondency over the seeming disorder that prevails in the experience of the contemporary city. And I ask, why would we be despondent? Gutschau provides his own answer. The urban space system in the city center today and the socio-cultural infrastructure that still support the city's population are largely 4 decades old. The city has been deprived of new schools, libraries, community centers, parks, museums, and performance centers, edifices which impart pride in a city for its citizens and build strong communities. The Kathmandu of today forces us to ask, whose city is this? Kathmandu has certainly provided a space to all segments of Nepali society, but that space depends on who you are and how much capital you bring with you. In the chapter Prestigious Houses or Provisional Homes, the god as a symbol of Kathmandu Valley peri-urbanism, Andrew Nelson narrates the travails of Vijay, a young bound man from Gorkha. His family decides to buy a plot of land in Kathmandu to build a house, almost entirely because of the social prestige that comes from having a house in Kathmandu. They take out a loan to build a 2-story home so they can rent out the lower floor, the same rationale that has driven the construction of thousands of homes with outdoor staircases and separate entrances. Vijay is struggled with the loan, but he can barely afford to pay the monthly interest. The house remains unfinished, and his marriage prospects, which the house was supposed to better, remain the same. Only his family in Gorkha benefits. They now have a house in Kathmandu. Kathmandu is a siren, luring you in with promises of wealth and prestige, and then plunging you down into the depths of poverty and shame from which you never really emerge. Nelson concludes as much, writing that building a house in Kathmandu offers access to the middle class while also threatening to drag them down into poverty. Still, thousands hear the sirens cry and come every year, buying up plots of Rana land that lack water, electricity, or plumbing. Thousands are willing to sell land in the Mofussil to pay astoundingly high prices for land in Kathmandu. These prices not being an index of supply and demand, but rather an index of control. As Andrew Haxby writes in the chapter, can a financial bubble burst if no one hears the pop? In the chapter, Haxby illustrates how land and housing, much like everything else in Kathmandu, is driven by the shadowy actions and transactions of a political and economic elite. The Kathmandu of today is characterized as much by the failure of top-down state-led planning processes as informal bottom-up challenges to the attempt to establish order and build a modern aesthetic city. Suming Ningleku's chapter, Inauthentic Sukumbasi, the politics of aesthetic and urgency in Kathmandu, is an attempt to delineate these challenges through Sukumbasis, whom the state calls squatters. Ningleku writes, Kathmandu's transformation in the last 2 decades may be characterized by several factors. The gentrification of state spaces that favor the property residents for accessing municipal services, the vision of urban gigantism, underwriting direct investments which fund the construction of high-rise buildings and gated communities, and the conformity of such transformations to elusive logics such as aesthetics, civilization, and modernity. Sukumbasis thus are a natural eyesore to the aesthetic city. Politics of aesthetics in Kathmandu is not so much about moving towards a futuristic city with high rises and neon lights, but more about going back to an idealized, romanticized past, a pure civilization symbolized by the once pristine waters of the Bhagavati. Sukumbasis are the polluters of this purity and thus must be excised from the body of the city. If a scalpel won't do, then a bulldozer must suffice. In the books afterward, Ningleku writes how Kathmandu is multiple cities within one. The heritage town of Old Kathmandu, Lalitpur and Bhaktapur, the modern city of brick, concrete and glass, and the slum city of Sukumbasis. It is within and across these 3 cities that the geography of power is exercised through urban planning. Like Sukumbasis, there are other smaller and more subtle challenges to the city's social and hierarchical order. In the chapter Scooty Girls, Gender, Mobility and Intimacy at the Edge of Kathmandu, Jan Brunson illustrates how scooters have helped liberate young urban girls from the yoke of social pressures and the panoptical gaze of their family, friends, and neighbors. Newly mobile and independent on their scooters, these Scooty girls seek the edges of social governance, writes Brunson, much like the gangsters in Rashmi Sheila's chapter, Identity and Representation of Gangsters and Gangs. In that chapter, members of the T gang, though not poor or marginalized, also seek the edges of governance, indulging in petty crime like dealing marijuana and hash and taking part in minor scuffles. There are also the prostitutes and meat eaters of Mark Leakey's carnal economies, the commodification of food and sex in Kathmandu. Sexual and culinary exchanges both involve passing or crossing frontiers, thresholds or orifices of the individual as well as the social body, writes Leakey. As Leakey traces how the consumption of food and sex have evolved in Kathmandu, I can't help but think of how things have changed since the article was first published in 2005. Past the Nakku Bridge in Lalitpur, a row of Sekwa shops offering fragrant barbecued pork now find more bound and Chhetri customers than rice limbus and talents. Prostitution too has moved from the massage parlors of Tamils to the open streets of Ratnapark, Lazimpark and Balaji. Carnal consumption is no longer on the margins, but out in the open, out in the public, open for everyone to see. The right to the city is constantly being questioned, whether by slum dwellers or by pedestrians and cyclists. As Prashant Khanal, Anova Gurung and Priyankar Badurchand point out in their chapter, road expansion and urban highways, consequences outweigh benefits, the city restricts diverse modalities of mobility. Walking, cycling, or taking a bus have been deliberately made burdensome and unattractive. Bikes and cars are what the city desires, not pedestrians who pay zero road tax. Yet citizens persist, skirting potholes, garbage, and open drains, dodging cars and motorbikes. From these articles, Kathmandu emerges as a contradicting, perplexing city, an absurd city, as the late Kamal Mullah would say. Caste and class, economics and politics, top-down and bottom-up, memory and forgetting, the aesthetic and the inesthetic, mobility and static, all shape Kathmandu day by day. This is a city in a constant state of becoming. Kathmandu is not arborescent, but a rhizome, eschewing linearity and order, flourishing as a multiplicity and a substance.
Thank you for that reading and for your commentary.
How over did I go?
No. You're just fine. 13 minutes, 20 minutes. So now our third leader and commentator, Rachana Ji, will deliver her comments.
Thank you. कति राम्रो story like follow गर्नु difficult like to follow. मलाई like 2 months ago when Sumina G, I don't know if he's in the room, Sumina is not here. When he texted me asking can you review the book, I was just wrapping up 4 years of my study in Kathmandu. That's why I have a lot to say. धेरै कुरा भन्नु छ, but I've timed it. It's 15 minutes and I'm going to power through. So first of all, congratulations to the editors on the publication of this important anthology. As a scholar working on urban disasters, I must admit, for my own research, the collection came like a year late. But anyone who's beginning research in Kathmandu or urban spaces in Nepal, this anthology offers a rich and expansive starting point. It brings together a wide range of perspectives that speak to our city's layered complexities. I'll also take this moment to extend my appreciation to the often faceless and nameless forms of labor that go behind such publications, the unrecognized workers of academia, like workers that sustain academia. Thank you very much for this important work. Now, when I was invited to speak at this event, I asked the organizer what was expected of me, and they said, like, Sumina Ji who said, take everyone in a spin. And I was like, after reading this anthology, I felt like I found myself in a bit of a spin because there's a lot going on inside. But the anthology also made me like pause and reflect, like why is this anthology centered around Kathmandu and not any other city in Nepal like Viratnagar, Linder or Chitwan. So I think a collection, what it does is it implicitly and explicitly raises the same question, the hegemony of Kathmandu in the making of Nepali nation state, if there is one. So this anthology doesn't just reflect on Kathmandu, it also invites us to think about what it means for Kathmandu to be that object of reflection. Now I'm just going to stop that here because I'm going to come at it at the end of my talk. Now turning into the collection itself, it is structured into 3 thematic sections: urban forms, urban cultural politics, and urban lives. Despite the structure, the content of each section overflows into and overlaps with the others, resisting rigid boundaries. One aspect that particularly stood out to me was how the middle section, focusing on memory and identity, operates not just as a thematic focus, but as a kind of motif that resonates throughout the entire collection. It serves as an organizing thread that brings coherence to the collection. In its entirety, the collection of articles made me feel like that our city is trying to force an identity, a modern identity, yet one that remains tethered to the nostalgia of a selectively remembered past. And there is no consensus what that past is. This tension between identity, aspiration, and nostalgia takes many forms and runs through many chapters in this collection. For instance, Gustav's contribution traces the history of urban development and town planning in Kathmandu, highlighting how early planning imaginaries were steeped in aesthetics and moral anxieties. He cites the first physical development plan from 1965, which described the nascent urban expansion in the valley as the visual cry that was defining the imagined beauty of the city. The language reflects a nostalgic attachment to an idealized urban past, positioning modern expansion as a threat to a constructed sense of urban purity. At the end of the first section, Ninleku compellingly explores this persistent idealized urban imaginary vis-a-vis the lived realities and struggles of encompasses or squatters in the city. This chapter challenges the dominant narrative that romanticizes Kathmandu's past by foregrounding the contestations over space and legitimacy that define the lives of those excluded from both the future vision and the nostalgic past of the city. The rest of the 4 articles in the first section of this anthology explore this disjuncture between planning, as an authoritative discourse, and the messy lived realities of urbanization and urban living in Kathmandu. In their own ways, the 4 articles highlight the tension between the desire for urban planning and the desire for urban living. The social prestige of constructing a Kathmandu Nagar fuels and in some sense also outweighs the risk of capriciousness of the housing market and complicated land politics. While Sahan, Nelson and Hagsby draw attention to the informality of what is considered as the formal urbanization in Kathmandu, Khanal and his colleagues question the very foundation of urban development, and in their case they talk about road expansion, implicitly asking who these plans are really for, whose vision of the valley they aim to serve. At first glance, this contribution appeared to address the visible, everyday problems of urban life in the valley. But if we look closer, the question they raise go much deeper. As I mentioned earlier, what's at stake here is not just urban planning, it's the very practice of state making. Each article, in its own way, points to 2 driving forces behind urban sprawl in the valley: urban migration and land use change. Urban migration, which until recently mostly meant people moving into Kathmandu, Nepal's only urban center, is closely tied to the transformation of land across the valley. Depending on how far each author takes us, the causes of this shift vary, from the most recent trends of foreign migration for employment and study, to displacement during Maoist insurgency, to the political upheavals of the Jana Andolan movements. And if we dig even further, we arrive at the very roots of the Nepali state itself, in the unification of Nepal under the Sahakas. When urban sprawl is tied to the urban migration, the logic of planning and governance often finds itself in constant tension with those deemed as outsiders, as if the city must defend itself against those who do not supposedly belong here. Now, this question of belongingness to the city becomes more prominent as we head into the next section, the second section of the anthology. The identity of the city, the identity that the city had been striving to force takes on a sharper form in Rademacher's retelling of Bagmati River conservation story. The question of who gets to belong to the city finds a clearer answer here. It is those who are seen as part of the so-called Bagmati civilization. With Bagmati civilization narrative, the question of belonging gets a temporal dimension, as only those whose ancestry in the valley predated the modern migration influx since 1950s can belong to Kathmandu, Rademacher writes. Now, this selective rendering of the past to reinscribe the ideas of identity seems to be like a political tool in contemporary Nepal, which is also evident in Whitmarsh's discussion around the construction of Ganatantra Smarak within the Narayan Hiti Museum. Commissioning a national monument, the post-conflict Maoist-led government sought to utilize the past selectively, writes Whitmarsh. Well-intentioned as it may, people rather than monarchy, well-intentioned as it may, the Ganatantra Smarak falls short in acknowledging the need to represent a diverse and often diverse in public groups with different stake in how history is remembered and retold. The reluctance of the ruling party to invite public participation in the design selection process suggests an attempt to smooth over a deeply contested history. And the same question gets powerfully reiterated. Whose past can be legitimized into the future of this city and that of the Nepali nation state? The undertones of temporal sense of belonging, who has the rightful claim to the valley, also resonates with Lotter's article Heritage Construction in Kathmandu Durbar Square post-2015 earthquake. The question is, who is the rightful arbiter of heritage knowledge? Is it the state, or the local government, or the community? Lotter highlights how this debate has moved beyond the ethnic lines and is more about cultural competence. Who truly understands and respects the layer of meaning embedded in these sites? Now, while much of the section engages with the question of national identity and belonging, it is important to remember that these discourses are really neutral. The seemingly genderless language of national identity and belonging often carries an implicit masculine form, especially in a patriarchal society like ours. In contrast to this grand narrative, of nationhood and belonging, Brunson shifts our attention to everyday, to the scooty girls, young women navigating not only the streets, but also the gender norms of urbanizing city in their two-wheelers, with their everyday mobility decisively breaking away from a version of a past, asserting new ways of being in a city that is itself in transition. I wonder if it is a stretch to say that the forested hinterlands of the valley serve as sanctuaries, spaces where those who cannot easily exist in the center find a degree of freedom. In Brunson's world, this takes the form of intimacy, young unmarried couples seeking the privacy that public spaces of the city deny them. In other cases, these peripheral zones continue to provide a livability to many, particularly migrants to the city, who are pushed to the edges not only in city's geography, but also in its urban imaginations. The third and final section of the anthology shifts our attention to the material foundation of urban identity, to economics, labor, and patterns of consumption. The 6 articles in this section traces the trajectory of a city in transition, capturing how Kathmandu's evolving identity is shaped not only by plans and narratives, but also by everyday workings of markets, informal economies, and physical infrastructures. Lichi's exploration of the commodification of food and sex reveals the shifting moral anxieties around practices like eating out and sleeping out, acts that were once heavily regulated by caste-based values but are now increasingly shaped by the logic of free market. But what was once moral and cultural domain have become value-neutral transaction. But the reach of the market does not just stop there. Other forms of exchange, such as the bodies, youth, and labor of Nepali migrant workers involved, represent another facet of the same commodification. In such an economy, as Sanda theorizes in this volume, the body that is not engaged in transaction, a body that waits, is rendered valueless. In the free market economy, the bodies of both men and women become commodities, consumed in different ways, across different spaces. Those who are not absorbed into the grueling labor markets of the Gulf often find value elsewhere, within the city itself, as gang members. Rashmi Sheela traces the emergence of gangs in Kathmandu, mapping the trajectories of young men and exploring how their bodies, identities are co-opted into political projects. Here too, the body is transactional, used, positioned, and mobilized for power. So if neoliberalism is both our present and future, it is not only bodies that are commodified, but places are too. Spaces once embedded with cultural meanings or collective memory are increasingly treated as assets, ready for repackaging and branding. Urban land and entire neighborhood are transformed into commodities, subject to the same market logic that governs the labor and consumption. Linder explores this commodification of place through the case of Tamil, a neighborhood that holds an exceptional space in Kathmandu's popular discourse. He shows how the name Tamil has become a brand in itself, packaged, marketed, and sold, transforming a lived space into an economic asset. Now, the same tug of modernity versus nostalgia resurfaces here. So, what is the identity of the contemporary city? For me, just come back from living elsewhere. For me, this identity of a modern city is captured in a single striking image of contemporary Kathmandu, which is like a foreign-bound modern Nepali queuing at a falsa bus stops that you see in Kathmandu everywhere these days. That image for me, it embodies a quiet contradiction, and I think it is a very, very befitting identity of what this city is. Now, taken together, the 3 sections of this anthology offers us a layered, often uncomfortable, but necessary understanding of Kathmandu's urban transformation, from the uneasy dance between planning and lived realities, to the politics of identity and belonging, and finally to the commodification of bodies and places under neoliberal logic. This contribution revealed that the city is not just a built environment, but a battleground of aspirations, exclusions, negotiations, and reinventions. What this volume ultimately invites us to consider is that Kathmandu is not a finished product, but an ongoing project, shaped as much as by state policies, as by the everyday practices, by the margins as much as by the center, and by those who are visible as much as those who remain unseen. It is in this constant making and remaking the story of the city unfolds. Now, before I finish, which I will now,
Don't worry. Yeah.
But before I finish, I want to go back to the question that I started with. What does it mean for Kathmandu to become the object of reflection here, right? The meaning making within the contribution of this anthology and beyond it, it's not static, it's continuous evolving process. But what lingers for me is a deeper and more awesome question. The question that I want to raise here is like, who is doing this meaning making, right? How do we as scholars and citizens come to know what Kathmandu is and what Kathmandu is becoming? In academic research, we often fall back to the language of ontology to explore this foundation. But what happens when the frameworks we use are not fully our own? What might it mean to theorize this layered, kaleidoscopic city through a lens that is rooted here, in our own intellectual histories, our lived experiences, and our cultural imaginations? How do we as Nepali scholars begin to articulate a non-Western cosmology of knowledge, one that allows us to not just study Kathmandu, but to understand it on its own terms? Thank you.
Wow, that was exactly 15 minutes to the second. So Rachana ji, thank you, and Pranaya ji and Sumina ji, thank you. We started a little late, so we started around 3:15 because of the traffic jam, etc., etc. Now I open the floor for questions. Even if you haven't read the book, you are entitled to, you can ask questions. So I will obviously, you can shoot questions to a specific speaker or to all of them. If you have any questions regarding the production process of the book, meaning it's all from the point of conceptualization several years ago, as Ben was talking in his video, to the time when it was actually published last month, I'll be happy to answer that. So please raise your hands.
Even to the authors question.
Oh yeah. We have at least two authors here. Or one. When they were speaking, I suddenly realized I actually don't know all the authors in the volume. So I only identified two who have informed me and two who I know that they would be here. But other contributors to the volume who I simply don't know, I've never met. Or koi chha chaina. So okay, yeah, we have two of the contributors here as well. So go ahead.
It's a fairly long question, so please do bear with me. And when I came recently from outside Nepal, and when anyone from outside would ask me where in Nepal I'm from, I would just say Kathmandu for the sake of simplicity. But that's not entirely true. Kathmandu is not my home, and like many people probably sitting in this room as well, I do not put Kathmandu as a permanent address in my citizenship, even though I've lived my entire life here. So it is at most my second home. So how would any of you, or like even the authors, explain or think of this unique position that Kathmandu holds for many of us? Does Kathmandu then become an example of how different identities that exist within the country come under the same umbrella, or does it become equally isolating and equally alien for all of these identities and just become crowded and impersonal as urban cities tend to do? And in a nation fairly used to federalism right now, it has been 10 years. How would this image of Kathmandu change currently or in the time coming in the future?
Do you expect them to answer your question?
I have no answer. I have more questions of my own actually.
No, I think that's
It's perfectly okay not to have answers to the questions that are raised. So if nobody's comfortable answering his question, then we just move ahead. You'll have to answer your own question. Sorry.
This is not an answer, but I think like
I'll get to your microphone.
But I think that also resonates with the same questions that we've been trying to raise, like what is this hegemony of Kathmandu? Having said that, like putting that aside, but I think like it's also important to recognize that Kathmandu is a melting pot, and you can take it and make it own. Like that's what we're saying. Like as much as like it is the hegemony of Kathmandu exists, but it also gives that like what you just said. You can just take it and make it your own. So does it have to be? This is not this is just a reflection of what you just said.
Sure.
This is not an answer. So I think like that's Savitri is not here, but he writes about this everyday resistance, right? And that's how you resist to that hegemony. You just take it and make it your own.
I have a question for you. When you said that you've actually, I don't know if you're born in Kathmandu, but you've lived here most of your life. So don't you feel like you're engaging a little bit of jelly when somebody asks you where are you from and you say, not really, Kathmandu is my second home. Don't you feel like you're acting a little bit jelly? I ask you that question because I was also born in Kathmandu. I've lived here all my life except for the time when I've lived outside of Nepal. I could also draw upon my father and my grandfather's home in Gorkha, but I don't do that. That would be a little jelly on my part. So I'm just saying, sorry to put you on the spot. Aru hatu thamta?
तपाईँले झेली भन्नुभएर चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ जेली भनेको
मैले झेली नै भने हो। Sumanji.
Hello, I'm Suman Bastet. I'm a member at Martin Chautari. I'm in the engineering here in Kathmandu. It was very interesting to hear all three of your perspectives. And you talked a lot about how different parties in Nepal, in Kathmandu, try to develop a narrative for Kathmandu, right? And depending on the interests and power, different narratives are there. Could I dare to say that this book is also trying to create a narrative for Kathmandu, trying to portray Kathmandu from a certain perspective, maybe for Martin Chautari, maybe Pratyushi, maybe somebody. And can I dare to say that from what I've heard from you, it seems to be a slightly negative narrative of Kathmandu. What do you think?
Before you answer, the final selection was done all by Ben. So I had nothing to do with what's selected in the book. I advised him, obviously, when he sent me the initial TOC, table of contents, with he thinks it's 50 articles, I think it's 45. So somewhere between the initial TOC had 45 to 50 articles. So I said, it will not become one book. It has to be more than one book. Anything bigger than 500 pages is very difficult to produce and to actually read as a reader. So the final selection was done by him. As I said, I'm the commissioning editor, but I didn't decide the content. So little bit of jelly is not allowed. सुमनजीले सोध्नु भएको कुरा एकछिन सुमनजीले सोध्नु भएको कुरामा केही जवाब
So, it's not an answer really, but like, for me, reading the book, I didn't think it was, I would say it's negative, because, at the end of the day, it's an academic work, it's a scholarly work, it doesn't assign, moral judgment, this is good, this is bad, भनेर त्यस्तो लेखिएको छैन। त्यस्तो लेख्न पनि, I don't think that's the kind of book that this is. It's not trying to say that.
I haven't read the book, so yeah.
So, but I don't think most scholars don't usually tend to say that this was great or this was bad. Like, they generally describe how certain processes work, which is what this book is kind of doing. It's trying to show you, how, multiple processes of framing the city, maybe developing a narrative of the city. The articles themselves, I don't think they propose like a certain narrative. So that's just me. Maybe you guys are.
So yeah, अलिकति डिफरेन्स छ मेरो चाहिँ एकाडेमिक राइटिङले अब त्यो अन्डरस्ट्यान्डिङलाई अझै निखार्ने होला होइन, त्यसको पर्पज के होला, त पढ्ने मान्छेको आफ्नै एउटा सर्टेन बायसेस होइन, आफ्नो अन्डरस्ट्यान्डिङ हुन्छ, एउटा संसारलाई हेर्ने एउटा भ्यू हुन्छ होइन। त्यसैले मैले त्यो फर्स्ट पार्ट पढ्दाखेरि चाहिँ मलाई झर्कै लाग्यो क्या, टु बी अनेस्ट होइन, किनभने नट बिकज अफ द राइटिङ बट बिकज लाइक वाट काठमाडौँ हेज बिकम भन्ने कुरा क्या, बिकज प्लानिङ पनि छैन, बाटो पनि भत्किएको छ, सुकुम्बासीहरूलाई पनि खेलाएको छ, but then there is a ray of hope as well, like everyday resistance-को कुरा हुन्छ, how सुकुम्बासीज आर negotiating with people in power पनि हुन्छ होइन। So त्यो पनि छ, but then फर्स्ट पार्ट चाहिँ मलाई अलिकति दुःख नै लागेको, as someone who has been living in this city for quite some time now. Yes.
Well, Mr. also from engineering background. We work for centers. Okay, my question, it's completely new to me, a subject like this. As I said, it belongs to something very different. My question is, probably because I missed the initial part, which is traffic jam. what led to the creation of this book? Basically, what was the objective? And then how the three thematic themes were selected, and also how the contributors were assembled. What do you see?
It'll be a little jelly on the rest of the audience because Ben covered that and I also covered that in my initial remarks. It's very simple. As a lifetime Kathmandu resident, I wanted to create a book on Kathmandu.
Great.
So Mark Lichty and I went to graduate school together and I first proposed the idea to him, right? Now Mark and I are getting a little old. So we decided that it wasn't going to happen between him and me. So we figured out we would have to approach somebody younger, and Ben Linder happens to be Mark's PhD student. So I proposed the idea to Ben roughly about 5 years ago. He selected a whole bunch of articles, 45 to 50 of them, and then he basically, I never told him what should be in the book. I told him basically, I cannot produce a 800-page book. Anything beyond 500 is not a very handy book, right? So he had to cut. What that means is, and one of you kind of hinted that there should be many Kathmandu readers. That should be quite obvious to people in the room, right? And probably, a whole bunch of historians should look at Kathmandu before 51. And Pirish, Rana Joshi, and several of our architectural historian colleagues are now looking at the modern encounter of Kathmandu. They produced an exhibition last year and this book, Modern Encounters in Architecture, looking at Kathmandu from roughly, let's say, 1935. Right? 1935 to roughly Panchayatko endsamma bhanau na. Looking at the work of Nepali architects, as well as Bidesi architects who came to Nepal to design what could be described as post-Malla, post-Rana buildings. From private homes to big public buildings as well. So that important work is being done by the Kathmandu Institute, colleagues there. Obviously, the articles that did not make it into this book could make it into some other book. So I really hope that some other scholar, editor, will produce such a book in the near future.
Fantastic. Congratulations. Something accomplished in a lifetime.
Hi.
Yeah, I'll get it.
My Upadhyaya बोल्छु न मैले सबैजना देख्दिनँ कि बस्दा
हुन्छ हुन्छ
के अरे so as somebody who's lived in Kathmandu all my life as well के अरे the way I interact with Kathmandu is extremely selfish. I am also Kathmandu अनि आहा कस्तो त्यो मलाई जे मन पर्छ अथवा जे भइराछ काठमाडौँ मेरो लागि भइराछ खालको वेले I consume हैन अनि अब वेदर पनि आहा मेरो लागि कति राम्रो भइदिन्छ it's a very selfish way of looking at it and so like but something that I've never done is take Kathmandu very seriously. So चिजै भइराछ मेरो वरिपरि भइराछ and also moving with it. It's a live entity, it's expanding, it's कहिले it seems very small, कहिले कहाँ जस्तो feel हुन्छ काठमाडौँ भित्रको नहुँदै पनि तर I've never really looked at Kathmandu academically or analyzed it any like अलि surface भन्दा अलि तल त गयो होला when there are certain things happening politically तर त्यस्तो एकदम this explains why Kathmandu moves this way or works this way. But मैले पनि खासै examine चाहिँ गरेको छैन. Do you find as people who read the book that I don't know how you guys interact with Kathmandu at all. But did you find maybe किताब पढिसकेपछि चाहिँ it helps explain some of Kathmandu to you like how has the way that you view Kathmandu or experience Kathmandu changed before and after reading the book if there has been any change at all? The कहिले हुन्छ नि केही पढेर सकाइसकेपछि you find a reference somewhere out in the wild and you're like मैले यसको बारेमा पढेको थिएँ this explains it भन्ने खालको.
Anybody?
Just some one is like that I've been reading about Kathmandu for the last 4 years, so yes I think to some extent like okay हाम्रो Sam sorry पनि भन्यो but there is not a narrative, there are narratives, right? And I don't think there will be like a magic bullet that will explain everything, but there are like a lot of explanations. अनि त्यसमा चाहिँ मैले अघि पनि रेज गरिरहेको कुरा के त्यो लेन्स चाहिँ हामीले के लिएर अर्बन पोलिटिकल इकोलोजीको लेन्सले हेर्नुहुन्छ भने खोलालाई एउटा हिसाबले देख्नुहुन्छ हैन. अब तपाईले so what kind of lens do you look at to the city, that will give you that kind of explanation. अनि मलाई चाहिँ ठ्याक्कै तपाईँ यो क्वेसन गरिरहँदाखेरि टमस बेलको त्यो किताबमा एउटा प्याराग्राफ छ के उहाँले चाहिँ काठमाडौँ भने कस्तो हो भने कुनै केओसलाई आई कान्ट त्यो वर्बचिङ चाहिँ भन्न सक्दिनँ आइम जस्ट ट्राइङ टु एक्सप्लेन वाट यु रोट द्याट कुनै केओसलाई चाहिँ त्यो सबै डिरेक्सनमा मिरर राख्यो भने कस्तो देखिन्छ काठमाडौँ भनेको त्यही हो भनेर लेख्नु भएको छ कि एक ठाउँमा काठमाडौँ भन्ने किताबमा सो त्यो केओसलाई यो बुकमा चाहिँ के गरिएको छ भने त्यही 3टा सेक्सनमा चाहिँ इट्स ट्राइङ टु एक्सप्लेन सम बिट्स अफ इट एन्ड इट्स अल्सो भेरी टेम्पोरली लोकेटेड हुन्छ नि आजभन्दा 25 वर्ष अगाडिको कुराको एक्सप्लेनेसन त आज हामीले खोजेर हुँदैन होइन सो लाइक इन अ पोजिटिभ नोट यस इट्स अ भेरी भेरी गुड स्टार्टिङ पोइन्ट बट नो इट डज नट एक्सप्लेन एभ्रिथिङ द्याट गोज अराउन्ड इन काठमाडौँ
I agree. So I don't think you पढेर चाहिँ त्यही मलाई पनि त्यस्तो I didn't feel like and I now understand Kathmandu because I have been Kathmandu has been an obsession of mine for I don't know 15-20 years now, but not in a way where it's like I'm not trying to understand Kathmandu as like यो कसरी प्लान गरियो यो कसरी सिटी इभल्भ भयो त्यो भन्दा पनि more as an experiential place, right? Like where things happen and then we experience it and we interpret it through our own subjectivities. So this book provides you that kind of like, it provides a point of access where you can say, oh wow, that's something that I hadn't thought about. Or maybe that's something that is very interesting. Like for me, in this book, so one of the most interesting chapters was the Mark Litte chapter about food and sex. And it was great because I mean, once he put it out there about how those two things are so interrelated, I was like, yeah, they very much are. And I don't know why I had not really connected those two. And to see how he's like, trace the evolution of both, restaurants, eating out and prostitution and sex and all of that, that was super interesting for me. So I think you will also find like those kind of, small little points of access where you're like, yeah, that's great. But I don't think you'll find something that'll be like, this explains Kathmandu.
In his earlier comments, Pranaya pointed out that he just said that he really liked Mark's chapter, but in his earlier comments, he also pointed out that the chapter was a little dated. And that's because Mark actually did this research in 1991. Before some people in this room were born, right? How do I know that? I went to graduate school with him. And I reconfirmed with him just last week. The first version of this article, the longer version, was published in our journal, which Mark and I and other people established in 96, in 2001. And the version that's been reprinted in this book was published in Cultural Anthropology in 2005. It's the shorter version. So it doesn't need somebody as smart as Pranaya to figure out that this research is old. So one of the main reasons why this book has been put out is that this is kind of like a selection of articles that are already out there. Hopefully, when people read these articles, they'll figure out, hey, let's do some interesting new research. That's also one of the main purposes. And as Ben was pointing out in the video earlier, and as Rachana Ji also said, an anthology of this nature is actually quite useful for senior undergrad students looking for serious research material to read, and for first-year graduate students trying to figure out what the hell is happening in their life, okay, or the topic that they will choose to do research for the next 5-6 years of their lives. Your turn. So you can identify yourself as well, please.
No, sir, my name is Akriti. This question kind of pairs well with Eva's question. I was just wondering, as researchers and writers, as you kind of wrestle with the question of like Kathmandu, yo niche about Kathmandu and the Sulstahili, as you meet people in Kathmandu, who else are people asking that question in the same way? Like, are they trying to actualize yo Kathmandu and if they are, do you find that like kasto khalko manchele garcha testo conversations ko entry point kasari suru garnu huncha, like who is really even curious about what Kathmandu is as an entity, I'm just curious.
think everyone is. No?
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially like, when like when I was coming here, right?
Yeah.
When I was directed on another way, and then I went to Banisar Chowk, and they didn't let me come. And then I had to run from Banisar Chowk there. That's the time when I question Kathmandu. That's when I'm like, God damn this city, I hate it.
Yeah.
So that, and I think that happens in everyone's life. You step out of your house and yetro pwal cha, and कहिलेकाहीँ हिलोमा खुट्टा जान्छ and then you're like, oh God, who makes this city? कसले बनायो यो वार्डमा? म जान्छु त्यहाँनिर वार्डमा गएर complain. And that happens to everyone. We feel our engagement with the city comes at like times of when the city doesn't work as it's supposed to, right? It's like the Heideggerको त्यो hammer हुन्छ नि. Hammer, the moment the hammer is working, you don't think about it. The moment hammer stops working, that's when you're like, what is this thing? Why is it not working? So I think it happens to everyone, and हाम्रो conversation भइहाल्छ नि हैन that like
Everyone talks about it. Like, त्यही कुरामा नि, you're so frustrated all the time, right? You want to read your first chapter, going to the first chapter as well. You're like so frustrated with the state of Kathmandu, and you're like asking, is anything working in this city? Anything? And I would want to actually not write but then read about it. And definitely, I have a question like that. Are Nepali anthropologists at all interested in Kathmandu? Southern Kathmandu?
I don't know about anthropologists, but researchers are. One sitting right next to you.
You're the धेरै our anthropologists, ethnography. So yeah, so is that trend picking up amongst Nepalko researcher, writers? Definitely yes. That was one of my questions.
Yeah, but basically, after the 2015 earthquake, there's been a spurt of writings by Nepali academics. I wouldn't say most of them are anthropologists from various disciplines working on Kathmandu, mostly looking at the reconstruction that's taken place in Kathmandu, right? So that's it's a one group. Largely पर्छ हैन थ्यांक यू
त्यसमा एउटा कुरा छ त्यसमा चाहिँ कस्तो पनि
ठीक छ अहिले
अब काठमाडौँको बारेमा कसो पनि मान्छे काठमाडौँको बारेमा कसो लेख्छ भन्ने कुरामा चाहिँ नलेज पोलिटिक्स आएर जोडिन्छ होला कि हैन तपाईले काठमाडौँको बारेमा लेखेकै छ भने मेरो रिसर्च पनि काठमाडौँकै बारेमा हो अनि तर मैले अब चाहिँ म ब्रिस्टल युनिभर्सिटीमा युकेमा पिएचडी सक्दैछु भनौँ न तर अब मैले काठमाडौँ बारेमा लेख्दाखेरि अब कहाँ लेखिएको छ भनेर खोज्दाखेरि अनलाइन खोजिन्छ नि हैन सिनासकै आर्टिकल हामी अनलाइन भेट्दैनौँ हैन लेखिएको त होला अब यो धौलागिरी जर्नल भन्ने पनि छ एउटा हैन त्यसको त घरिघरि भेटिन्छ आर्टिकल हैन अनि सियास जुन संस्थासँग म आबद्ध छु हाम्रो पनि एउटा सानो जर्नल निस्किन्छ हैन त्यहाँ पनि लेखिएको छ काठमाडौँको बारेमा तर दिस इज स्ट्रिक्टली एकाडेमिक पर्सपेक्टिभ है मैले एकाडेमिया भन्दा बाहिर फिक्सनको कुरा गरे होइन नन फिक्सन राइटिङको कुरा गरे पनि होइन कि तर स्कलरली आर्टिकल्स कहाँ हुन्छ त्यसलाई हामीले साइटेसन गर्न अब हुन्छ नि अर्को साइटेसनको पोलिटिक्स हुन्छ मैले चाहिँ धौलागिरी जर्नल अफ नेपालको आर्टिकल साइट गर्दाखेरि हुन्छ नि त्यसले कतिको क्रेडिबिलिटी पाउँछ होइन त्यसले गर्दा देयर लाइक अ लट अफ लाइक कम्प्लेक्सिटिज अराउन्ड इट के लेखेका कुरा कहाँ छन् भन्ने कुरामा पनि
यो अनलाइनमै भेटिनुपर्छ भने जिद्दी गर्नेहरूसँग पनि कहिले कहिले त थकाइ लाग्छ कि अलिकति अनलाइनमा नभेटिने कुराहरू पनि हुन्छन् भनेर मान्नु पर्यो नि यस्तो यो यस्तो छ यो जर्नलको सुरुवात गरे 30 वर्ष भयो हामीले होइन 30 वर्ष मात्र भयो र यसको सुरुवाती वर्षहरूको बारेमा भर्खरै मैले एउटा ड्राफ्ट आर्टिकल लेखेर सिधाएको छु अनि त्यो आफूसँग भएको आर्काइभ पनि हेर्न पाइयो अनि साथीहरू फाउन्डर्सहरूसँग इमेल पनि गर्न पाइयो अनि इन द अर्ली इयर्स अफ द मेकिङ अफ दिस जर्नल आई सडनली रियलाइज that I actually didn't have access to email living in Kathmandu. So my colleagues based in North America were sending me articles for this journal in 3x3 discs and mailing them from the US to me, either directly from the mail, or finding Nepalis and Bidesi Mitras of Nepal who were coming to Nepal or Kathmandu from anywhere in North America, sending the packages there and we're getting them. That was only 30 years ago. Right? So I completely understand why anybody now just finishing training, would want everything available online. There's a lot of Nepal scholarship that's not there. So if you prioritize only what's available online in your scholarship, you are actually ensuring a disadvantage into your production. Commentary, side commentary. I absolutely agree that this has to be available full text online. होइन होइन अनि हाम्रो पब्लिसरलाई भन्न थालेको यति वर्ष भइसक्यो कि पब्लिसर इज एक्चुअली ओल्डर देन मी. So I'm already old. Publisher is even older than me and he's quite lethargic. He's not here right now. So अनि रमेश मलाई भेटेर हामीले होइन माधव मण्डलाको होइन सबै हाम्रो यङ राइटर्सहरूले चाहिँ यो डिजिटलमा भएन भन्छन्, कम्प्लेन गरेका रहेछन्, गर्नु पर्यो गर्ने भन्नुहुन्छ. But he has his own slow way of doing things, so we're still waiting for him to say this will all be digital. I mean, if you look at हाम्रो माटी चौतारीको website on this, we have the infrastructure ready to go fully digital, every full text, every article full text, but he has to make the decision. Sorry, you raised your hand.
Hi, yeah, actually my question was related to something that...
Do you want to identify yourself?
My name is Logan, I'm a graduate student from the US. As somebody who does work for the most part outside of the Kathmandu Valley, when I was listening to people kind of reflect on the reference to this word Kathmandu and all of the various fun and not so fun things that it can refer to, one kind of parallel signifier that has lots of reference that came to mind is the word Nepal, right? And there's lots of writing about what Nepal means to various people at different points in time, everything from very kind of seminal works like Mary Slessor's Nepal Mandala, which of course speaks to an older meaning of that word. I mean, if you talk to people in lots of different villages in the West where I work, Nepal means Kathmandu or the valley. And, you know, so I guess and there's a certain sense in which it almost seems like you could find a book from 15, 20, 50 years ago called Nepal, a Reader, with contents very similar to the table of contents here, which is just to emphasize that even if it hasn't been unified within one cover, and even if it takes on many different forms and appears in many different places, that Kathmandu does occupy, whatever that means, occupies a kind of place of privilege in academic writing about this country at large. And so one question that I had for you all, having read the book, as somebody who hasn't read the book, is how did reading the book help you situate this kind of slippery signifier Kathmandu within or against or vis-a-vis this other slippery signifier Nepal?
Before you, I understood your privilege part of the question, but I didn't understand this other part, the earlier part, where you said that the table of contents could probably be similar if such a reader had been produced 50 years ago. What was that?
At some points in time, and I think that's probably an overstatement, but just the sense in which a lot of the times if you do come across a piece of writing about Nepal, it's about Kathmandu. And if you go into a bookshop, especially English language bookshops, but probably Nepal language bookshops as well, at least the ones that I've perused, you'll find many, many texts.
Okay, I'll get back to you. Yeah.
Is that true? Because I really I haven't read a lot of academic work on Nepal, but from what I've read, so much of that academia is set in outside Kathmandu. It's like Kirtipur or like, I don't know, Longzung or somewhere in the mountains, or, you know, ethnography really is, I haven't read a lot that is just like Kathmandu based ethnography, like, except for maybe, I don't know, Gerard Toffman or something. Even he spent so much time outside Kathmandu, Panauti and all. So, but I don't know, maybe I'm...
Well, I think like I'm guilty of what you just said, because I you know, like Sabini writes about like tells of three cities, but we do use Kathmandu as a signifier. You know, the valley is more than just Kathmandu. You know, there are like 11 municipalities and I don't know all the numbers, but Kathmandu is more than these three cities. So I'm guilty of that, using Kathmandu as a signifier. But coming to the reader, I think it's sort of like it has that diversity. It brings in like different geographic focus. It not only talks about that, it's not just obsessed about Kathmandu, but it's also like how Kathmandu is shaped in relation to the rest of the country. So I think the reader does a good job in incorporating all that.
I'm also not big time into academia, but then whatever I've come across, it has been like Kathmandu has been seen as this historical place, has been studied from a very heritage lens. Kathmandu's changed lives, consumption pattern, the infrastructure, the modern amenities, right? That has not been part of a lot of scholarly work, maybe more recently. But while I was doing my research while I was a student of anthropology as well, I didn't come across a lot of, academic work related to that urban aspect, urban culture, urban lives and identities of Kathmandu.
My own take on what you asked is that until about a generation ago, I mean, historians of Nepal who worked on Nepal, mostly Nepalis, wrote on the history of Kathmandu, right? So, but that stopped being the case, I would say 25, 30 years ago. A lot of that work does not actually exist in English. It only exists in Nepali, and it exists in different genres of writing. So that's one. Earlier, I think, I don't know if one of you actually made this point, and this, I think there's probably no public recognition of this in the last 10 years without actually people noticing it. There's now a plethora of publications on specific localities in Nepal. Most of this publication is actually happening not by commercial publishers, so nobody's actually advertising this. But a generation ago, when I was a graduate student, you would see something like Phalano Jilla ko Lekhakharu. But that has now gone to a level in which now Devendra, from whom actually I'm learning this stuff, and we've actually now a pretty good collection of these books in our library here. That level of detail is now moving to Phalano ward ko level ma. So it is actually factually incorrect to say, if you only look at books published in English about Nepal, then yeah, maybe Kathmandu focus, you could extend that and make the case that still a lot of Kathmandu focus. But if you look at the languages in which, other language in which stuff about Nepal is being published, it's factually incorrect to say that Kathmandu still remains the focus. And in fact, this very specific genre of documentary history is quite fascinating. Nobody is paying attention to it, but it's extremely useful for people who want to do solid empirical history on different parts of Nepal. One or two more, Suma G. Sorry. She had raised her hands. Yeah.
So rather than a question, it's a Samiksha Bhatai. And then so rather than a question, it's a reflection. So like Sumina, as you talked about how she felt more with reading the first chapter, and so I have almost done with the first chapters, first theme, and I think I felt like rather than more than like negativity, that's so I saw especially the first chapter, it was more like a reflection of like Kathmandu's resistance towards like coloniality and the very rigid idea of urban planning. I saw like Kathmandu has actively been resisting it, I guess. Obviously there are a lot of problems in Kathmandu. But then I saw it more as like Kathmandu has, from historically, from this Austrian planner coming here and like giving up to more and more like foreigners and that later foreign educated urban planners coming and giving up. I saw it more as like a celebration of like Kathmandu's active resistance towards this very Western idea of urban planning. And so I thought like I saw this first chapter as rather like a positive thing about Kathmandu rather than like a negative reflection of Kathmandu. So like that was just like a feeling I was giving this.
So when you read a chapter by somebody who trained in MIT, does that become a Western?
Yes.
It does?
It depends on what they're writing on. It depends on what they're writing on, right? From what perspective.
No, this is not a commentary on what you just said, but when people use this Western, I think I often reflect on my own life, the lives of people who I know sitting in this room, who have very complicated biographies, and we can no longer figure out exactly where we got a specific idea or a point of view or a point of perspective. So we all a mix of this and that. So I am a little worried if these very big categories are thrown around very easy. So we can have a chat later. अरू हात उठा छैन भने फेरि म सुमनजीलाई ए सरी हात उठा चाहिँ
Slightly misestimating, more accessible collection चाहिँ काठमाडौँमा चाहिँ 10-15 वर्ष अगाडि सोशल साइन्स बाहरले कलेक्सन गरेर सुरु गरेको विदेशको एउटा च्याप्टर छ लास्ट इयरमा पब्लिस भएको छ अनलाइन छ भनेर इट्स कल्ड comprises. Everything is 10-15 years ago. Public cases.
ठुलो टाइटल ठुलो सर भनिदिनु पर्यो.
Talking spaces. Online
Talking spaces भन्दै.
Talking spaces.
सिधै तपाईको.
So,
अलि नाम पनि.
म चाहिँ दिप्ती सिद्धार्थ. मेरो ब्याकग्राउन्ड चाहिँ आर्किटेक्चर.
You will have to be loud, little louder. Actually your side go भन्दा अनि त्यसपछि we are about done.
I'm just curious. यो रुममा कतिजना चाहिँ अर्बन प्लानिङ र आर्किटेक्चर ब्याकग्राउन्ड भएको छ? Nobody, right?
No. There is a Guruji sitting there. There is a Guruji sitting there.
So basically, एउटा चाहिँ त्यो पनि मलाई त्यो एकदम ठुलो ग्याप छ जस्तो लाग्यो किन like I had to come to Martin Chautari for the first time because I was designing a course on urban informality to teach. अनि त्यो lack of resource भएर चाहिँ म कहाँ जाने हुन्छ नि भनेर नि यहाँ आएको थिएँ कि अनि त्यही बेलामा किनेको हो यो किताब अरू रिसोर्सेसहरू पनि है बट अगेन लाइक getting back to this so as someone with a background in architecture and urban planning I keep thinking about democratic planning or design so यो प्यानलमा कति अब त्यो छ नि काठमाडौँ चाहिँ एकदम केयस छ भन्ने खालको केयस पनि छ तर त्यसमा के रेजिस्टेन्स पनि छ भन्ने चाहिँ त्यो एकदम एउटा डेमोक्रेसीको क्वेसन हो कि जस्तो पनि भइरहेको थियो होइन अनि काठमाडौँ सेप गर्ने चाहिँ मोस्टली के लाइक अब साँच्चै के अहिले टेबलमा बसेर होइन अहिले भर्खरै सेप गरिरहेको त त्यहाँ नक्सा कोरिरहेको धेरै छन् कि होइन सो बट एट द सेम टाइम त्यो केयस चाहिँ कसरी हुन्छ भन्दाखेरि होइन जस्तै डिजाइन गर्दाखेरि when you go and then you present the design अनि त्यसपछि क्लाइन्टहरूको जुन एजेन्सी देखिन्छ नि अनि त्यसले गर्दा अब एज समबडी विथ लाइक अ रिगरस ब्याकग्राउन्ड इन आर्किटेक्चर होइन त्यसले त एउटा त्यो एस्थेटिक त सेप गरिसकेको हुन्छ नि त होइन सो लाइक यो राम्रो यो नराम्रो यो प्रोपोर्सन भन्ने खालको जुन त्यो ब्याकिङ भएको हुन्छ नि तर अगेन when I come to like हुन्छ नि द आइडिया अफ डेमोक्रेसी नि रेजिस्टेन्स भएपछि चाहिँ अनि त्यो क्लाइन्टसँग झगडा गरेर आफ्नो हुन्छ नि इम्पोज गर्ने त्यो प्रोपोर्सन राम्रो देखिनुपर्छ भन्ने ठिक हो कि आफ्नो थियो नि लाइक इज द्याट डेमोक्रेटिक ओर के चाहिँ हो त भनेर जस्तो पनि भइरहेको थियो
यो त अलिक प्लानरहरू बिचको आन्तरिक छलफल गर्नुपर्ने Anybody? I kind of stopped you. Yeah, please.
I just want to, उहाँले भन्नुभयो नि यो resistance to this Western sort of ideas.
You want to stand up so that everyone can hear you?
So यो resistance को कुरा आयो नि, काठमाडौँ being shaped more by the resistance to the sort of Western sort of models of urban planning that were brought in here. I mean, I think you have to do a little more research on that, because that's not correct at all. अब काठमाडौँको हामीले हेर्ने जस्ट हिस्ट्री हेर्ने हो भने till about 18th century, this is what Kathmandu was and widely acknowledged all around the world as one of the really one of the advanced urban civilizations. A very advanced urban structure evolved here in almost 2000 years or 1500 years. And then since then, of course, but 950 पछि which in when we opened up the valley, the first highway out of Kathmandu was built in the late 50s, when the rest of the world was taking off on a jet plane. And then after that, this series of plans came in here, because it started growing, so everybody felt we needed to have plans so that growth can be sort of managed. Almost 90 some population of Kathmandu Valley. That means for the 2000 years in population. This was almost 10 times oil again. So in 30-35 years, the population has gone up 10 times. In the meantime, the number of urban plans have been made in Kathmandu. No other city in South Asia has made. We have made dozens of plans. So where the resistance? None of them were ever implemented. Because there is no political will or bureaucratic will or societal will, if you like, to use those plans. So it just went growing, and growing, and then everybody was pushing in their own directions. So it was less of a resistance and more of a push, really, from many directions, by many people. So I think that's something we should understand when we try to we can understand city. And I think in that respect, this is an important book, because, like I said, this city has grown up 10 times in the last 35 years. And yet the city has evolved over almost 2,000 years. So that's the paradox. And I think this is one of the very first attempt to try and get a sense of what this organism will do.
Thank you very much. I'll have to apologize. I think it's time to stop, and then conversations can obviously go on for a while. चिया र बिस्कुट बाँकी हुनुपर्ने हो छैन भने पनि चिया र बिस्कुट बिनाको कन्भर्सेसन्स पनि I welcome. So I want to obviously thank Ben, who is not here, but maybe he's still watching. Ben, thank you for putting together this book. I just hope that it will generate new series of research. And as I said, neither Ben nor the publishers think that this is the last word on Kathmandu. We all agree that there should be many more anthologies in Kathmandu put together by disciplinary practitioners, other disciplinary practitioners, urban planners, historians, fiction writers, development planners, disaster researchers, and others. And engineers also. So I want to thank you all for being here. As I said, the book's available 25% discount at our front desk. अनि हाम्रो वर्षमा दुईटा निस्किने स्टडीज इन नेपाली हिस्ट्री सोसाइटी भन्ने जर्नल छ. सो इफ यु एभर वान्ट टु कन्ट्रिब्युट एन आर्टिकल फर द्याट, प्लिज कन्ट्याक्ट वान अफ द एडिटर्स. अनि नेपालीमा चाहिँ समाज अध्ययन भन्ने जर्नल, it was delivered at 2:55 today, this issue. So if this interests you, this is a शिक्षा इतिहास विशेष अंक where most of what's being written is actually not about Kathmandu. But there is a chapter on Kathmandu. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.